Dever me agus fáilte roimh go dtí an cruniú peibli seo an údarás pólínachta an tarna cruniú as a chéile rud nach darlíonn cominic son ach léironn sé réimse na nábhar go bhfuil tácht baint agus gur gá iad a phlé go peibli leis a Commissioner agus a chomhlaice. Good afternoon, and you're very welcome to this public meeting of the Policing Authority of Ireland with the Commissioner of Garda Síochána and his senior colleagues. This is the second meeting in succession following on from the discussion last month, both because there was material that we had to defer due to the focus of last month's public meeting, and also because it gives us an opportunity to update those who are viewing and listening and the interested public on the developments on that issue, which was, of course, the 999 emergency calls question. The three items that we have on today's agenda are roads policing, the anti-corruption unit, and the 999 emergency calls. And we'll begin now with the roads policing, and I will ask Stephen Martin to begin with this one.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Commissioner and senior Garda colleagues. Commissioner, I'd like to ask you a question about Chiefs' authorisations. That's a policy that allows Chief Superintendents to give permission to a Garda member to drive a vehicle in the course of their duties, even if they haven't received appropriate driver training. Now, there were some 940 such authorisations in force at the end of May, and that was up 355 in the previous 6 months. And of those 940, some 637 drivers had no Garda Síochána driving qualification. So in that context, can you explain, please, the decision-making process around reintroducing Chiefs' authorisations when they had previously been discontinued? What do you assess as the risks with allowing untrained drivers to drive police vehicles, and how do you manage those risks?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Stephen. I'll turn to AC Paula Hillman just in a second, but to explain what happened, we have to go back to March of 2020, COVID pandemic, and then the pretty extraordinary operational response that was required from the organisation, part of which was a considerable enlargement of the fleet by some 210 vehicles, which were obtained for the short term from hire firms, and those were used as community support vehicles. And then on top of that, then we've since converted those into actual vehicle fleet as well. So over the last 18 months, we've seen considerable uplift in the fleet, but the community support vehicles were really where the pressure came on, because they weren't emergency vehicles as such. They would provide service or provide visibility, but they supported us in terms of a lot of the community engagement and the community support work that we were doing, particularly at a time when people were asked to in effect stay at home and cocoon, and we were providing a lot of services to those who were isolated by that particular advice. So that's the background against which the Chief's permission was introduced. The additional piece then is then that in the interim as well, for large periods of the last 18 months, we've been without any form of driver training, and those who have been qualified and say in some of the regions have moved on to other roles. There have been internal transfers, and we haven't been able to do in effect the backfill driver training to keep the necessary qualifications ongoing. This is a particular concern of the moment, but I know Paula can say more about just the situation we find ourselves in and the plan to get ourselves out of it. Obviously, it's not good that we have people driving police vehicles who've had no further driver training other than their own driver qualification. At the same time, we found ourselves both in terms of the operational pressures upon us, but also then the loss of our own driver training placed in this invidious situation. But there is a plan in effect to get us out of this. Paula, can you just give some more of the detail there, please?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, and yes, certainly, Stephen. Yes, as the Commissioner said, that Chief's permission was reintroduced in March 2020, given the exceptional times of COVID-19 and policing COVID-19. And I even think that it's important to recognise that even its terminology, even the terminology used for this, it wasn't just the same Chief's authorisation, which had previously been revoked in 2019. So we weren't just reintroducing what we'd previously done, and I think that's important because Chief's authorisation under the code did allow chief superintendents to authorise people to drive in a wider with wider parameters. So when March 2020 came and the Commissioner referred to the exceptional times that we found ourselves in, a interim direction policy was issued at that time. It was and it is referred to as Chief's permission, and that's why in some of the correspondence I have updated that to the Chief's permissions. It's clear that it was for the exceptional event, designated event of COVID-19, and there were clear restrictions outlined. When you talk about managing risk, there were clear restrictions outlined which were to be strictly adhered to. Speed limits should not be exceeded. Traffic regulations, emergency lights or sirens will not be used unless when the vehicle is whilst the vehicle is in motion, and the vehicles are to be used for the purpose of transportation around divisions and patrol to attend incidents within these restrictions. So that was made very clear in terms of due governance and management of risk that you'd also asked about, that this was to be reviewed monthly, and this is how we are now able and how managing that risk, that we are looking at this monthly with additional governance from the National Roads Policing Bureau. But this is the operational risk is managed at local divisions and then through their own regional structures. And we do continue to monitor that. And as the Commissioner has said, the position we've found ourselves in is over the last year, and with the exceptional circumstances, then we've had additional fleet come to us. We had the leased cars. We now have 134 community policing cars, which have replaced those leased vehicles. We've had new fleet into our overall organisational fleet, but also we've had no training at the non-specialist level. So
if I may,
an average with 400 people trained, but we haven't had that training been suspended.
We'll talk about training in a moment, if I may. So there's been a lot of new vehicles have been hired and some others purchased during I think you call them community vehicles earlier. So these permissions then don't relate purely to those vehicles. Is that right? They can extend beyond that. But you listed a number of constraints. Can you tell me how, when you're talking about hundreds of drivers across the country, how you can be satisfied that those constraints are being adhered to? And if I can paint a picture, so how can you be satisfied that untrained drivers, for example, are not being dispatched to emergency calls? Do the dispatchers in the control rooms know the qualifications that a particular driver holds before they seek to dispatch them to a call?
No, our dispatchers would not know the training qualification. And when you get that question about training and what records we have of training is really subject to a much wider issue. And actually we discussed it at one of the last Policing Authority meetings last week about being able to access IT and have ready access to who's trained and what. We don't have that information readily available, but it is something that we are manually when I come on to talk about what we're doing medium to longer term, we are manually trawling and going through records to get an understanding of who we have trained in what and where they are. But in terms of your specific question in relation to the Chief's permission, this it is managed locally through local detailing and regional, divisional and district officers. So there is also, I would suggest, personal responsibility, and I have seen it in specific examples where people have said they can't drive that because they're driving on Chief's permission. So the organisation clearly, I feel, clearly understands through their own line management the restrictions or the parameters that they're driving under on Chief's permission.
In the example that I painted, in that example, the driver would identify, sorry, I can't go to that call, dispatch another resource. Would that be the case?
Well, yes, we don't have an IT system that has to tell us which is the local nearest car to what. When we would proactively ask in terms of a pursuit policy, the patrol would proactively, control would proactively ask the level of training that the driver has in terms of making a decision around pursuit and whether or not to pursue. But what you would have within, even within a right down operationally, as people parade for duty, their local supervisors will know who is trained in what, and actually how they then detail them for what vehicles.
Okay, so the Commissioner in his opening remarks mentioned that you had a plan to, I suppose, de-escalate this and reduce the number. Can you tell me a little bit about that plan, please?
Yes. So we've two, the immediate and short, very short-term plan in terms of the Chief's permission is to really, it's actually to review or take off the shelf. We had a plan last September, so we did have a plan to do this last September. That had to be postponed because we went back into a further lockdown, and training, which was about to be reintroduced, was suspended again. So it's very much looking about what we were going to do last September, which is looking again at prioritising where the people are of the 600 that you mentioned, just over 600, and looking at a short, quick surge with our trainers in terms of a CPD1 training qualification to then totally reduce and eliminate Chief's permission. And if we do that, hopefully that will allow us to revoke that going forward. But that is only, that will fix what we have now for Chief's permission. This has to be seen as part of a bigger programme of work in terms of our wider driver training strategy, because we do talk about no qualification, but we need to understand very clearly organisationally who and identify who needs to be trained to basic standard and what that basic standard is. And then secondly, our focus, which I feel as the head of roads policing and with responsibility for this strategy and policy, is our regular members, our 24/7 who are going to the calls and their standard driving course that they need to be undertaking. And that needs to be built on a foundation of a needs assessment, a total understanding of who is trained, where they are. And secondly, the strategy the roadmap we have planned is the introduction of a training prioritisation board that will sit each year to identify where the spaces for that following year will be allocated to. And I think that in terms of basic and standard needs to be looked at as part of that.
Okay, so let me ask you, and I'm conscious I need to hand over to a colleague in just a moment. You talked about the de-escalation strategy. The one thing you didn't do is put an indicative time frame around it, so I'd be keen to hear about that. And the second thing is you mentioned that it needs to be seen in the context of a wider driver training strategy. So just conscious of time, can you tell me the indicative plan for the de-escalation, the time scale? And then my understanding was that you need to build capacity within your driver training, that you were looking at it releasing sworn Garda officers and replacing them with Garda staff. And then you've mentioned again the strategy. Who do we need trained and for what to support the strategic priorities? So there's a few questions there, but if you can start by giving me the timescale for the de-escalation strategy and then the developments in your training unit and the strategy that you've already outlined. Give me some ideas of when you think this is going to happen.
So firstly, in terms of the de-escalation plan, I wouldn't be able to give you a date today. I'm quite happy to give the authority a date once we get I get speaking to both then the college, the driver training, because while I own the policy and the policy for what we're going to do, I don't own the training, the people who train. So it's going to have to go into the executive, get that approval, and then go to the college. But so we can, once we've got that, come back certainly to the authority and give you a clearer date on when we see that happening.
Is it a priority for you?
Well, it's certainly a priority for me, but again, and I'm sure the Commissioner will come in perhaps as I finish, but yeah, I see it as one of our priorities for the organisation. But again, we recognise that in terms of our training, and one of the reasons we're in this position we're in is that all training was suspended for a period of time to focus on the front line and on COVID and policing COVID, and our trainers were redeployed to the front line. But certainly, my recommendation is it's one of our priorities in terms of driver training.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Final question, and I suppose it's a yes or no. Is this issue on the corporate risk register?
I don't believe it's in the corporate risk register. It's on my regional. So as the Assistant Commissioner for Roads, Policing and Community Engagement, I have a regional risk register, a departmental risk register. It's on my risk register, but it's not, as far as I'm aware, on the corporate risk register.
Okay, thank you. Just before I hand on to my colleague, with the Chair's permission, Commissioner, do you wish to add anything to that, or can we?
Well, just to say, we are alive to this issue. Regrettably, we are in this position around a lot of our training areas, in that we've lost so much training time over the last year and a half, and there will be a substantial tail to that. At least with this area, we can triage this in terms of who does the training. So some of this training may be outsourced. We attempted this before, but I do think we have to do that again. Secondly, then, the training that did happen since March of last year was concentrated on what we regard as the drivers needed in high-risk scenarios. So ERU, ASU, roads policing, they did get driver training commensurate with the standard that we would require for them. And so that happened. And also, you're correct to highlight the 637 members without a qualification at this moment in time. But as Paula has said, there is a route to quickly diminish that number. Now, the other, I count 303 who have a qualification. Some of them are well qualified, and we've just extended what they might drive. And again, it's not very difficult to resolve that. So that's 4x4 skills or whatever it might be. So some of this is doable. And then the piece you mentioned about Garda staff, that does require legislation or regulation to allow, in effect, a Garda staff member to be, in effect, tutoring someone at speed and beyond the speed limits, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Paula. Chair, may I hand over to Valerie? Who's going to talk about who's going to talk about Crow Hearth?
I do, yeah. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to just address the Crow Hearth report, and I suppose just to recap, it was back in 2016 when we were only starting in operation ourselves that a number of issues came to light regarding fixed penalty notices and mandatory intoxication testing. And when we look back, we recall that there was something like 150,000 incorrectly issued summonses over a period of years. There were discrepancies between breath tests recorded on Pulse and the data on the Draeger breath tests device database, which is maintained separately. And the scale was quite huge. I think it was the order of 1.5 million and possibly more. So we all recall the authority commissioned Crow Hearth in 2017, and they produced a report later that year. So in that report, there were over 30, I think it was 34 recommendations. And obviously, Commissioner, your own organisation then set about an implementation and to address all the recommendations. And we've been reporting and working together on this. And I want to commend actually the work of your own team and of the executive of the authority and the amount of work that's been done on this. Because I think in summary, we're really pleased to see the progress that's been made. This was a huge task addressing very serious issues. I suppose it demonstrates to an extent how this process can work effectively. If something's not working as it should, to find all the reasons and to fix them. And I think that's what we're seeing in action in this. And I think we appreciate too, it's not always easy. There can be process issues, systems issues, people issues, cultural issues. But as we understand it, of the 34 recommendations, I think all but 4 have been implemented. And what's left requires the cooperation of other agencies, and Garda Síochána is pushing ahead on these. So I would like to think with my colleagues to complement the work that's been done on this. Now, we have a couple of questions, and we will probably at an executive level still be following up on a lot of these in the future. But I just thought it was useful to say that today. I have a couple of questions. First of all, maybe very briefly, 2 kind of techie questions. In our private meeting, we got some information on this, but maybe for the benefit of the public, if you could explain briefly how the mobility devices have been a bit of a game changer in this, and where that plan is at, and what's the future rollout of the mobility devices. And the other techie question is on the Draeger machines. Do you have enough of those machines? Do you have enough people trained in their use? And I think we understand there's a procurement exercise underway for roadside testing kits. And will they have the same internal recording mechanisms that the Draeger machines have? In other words, that the data will be there to monitor for the future. So maybe just somebody could briefly address those 2 issues, and then I want to come to something else.
Okay, well, thank you, Valerie. Thank you for your very positive comments in respect of the progress we've made in respect of this report. If I could look to Andrew in the first place in respect of mobility, and then to Paul in respect of the Draeger devices.
Okay, thanks, Commissioner. Thanks, Valerie. So as you said, Valerie, the rollout of the mobile data stations has been a game changer in terms of the accuracy of the information that's captured at the roadside effectively in recording offences. So what we've seen is that previously, where there was about a 20% send back rate for paper, and in some cases the older handheld devices, that has been completely eliminated by the mobile devices. So all information is now being collected accurately. The second thing that's happened, which was part of the report, is that there was sometimes a time delay in sending the paper-based forms down for central processing, because that now happens in real time. It's immediately injected into the system, so that overall speeds up the processing of the devices. So, of the fixed payment notices. So, in terms of the rollout and the success of the devices, they have completely eliminated now paper-based issuing of fixed penalty notices across all penalty types. And the last of the handheld devices, I think probably just a few weeks ago, is the process now of being decommissioned. So those devices are being decommissioned, and all fixed payment notices going forward will be issued electronically, and then in real time they're being processed, and they're being processed with accurate information. So that piece of it is largely done. All road policing members have the devices, and we have prioritised the rollout of the devices to other Garda members that routinely would issue fixed payment notices. So not every Garda member, obviously, that might issue a fixed payment notice has the device. They have the ability to record them now electronically. So that issue is largely dealt with, I think.
Yeah. When do you think you'll be where you want to be in terms of the devices rolled out? And I know there's an app development side to that as well.
Well, the devices, the apps are only there from a roads policing perspective, and we did prioritise the development of fixed payment notice applications. So currently we have a little over 4,000, so we're well on track for the target for I think just over 5,000 this year to be issued. It's worth noting that they are the kind of the larger tablet style devices. In addition to that, we have another 3,000 smaller devices that are used by Garda management. So we're at well over half of the stage of all Garda members have the devices, and most of those, that covers pretty much, I think, all of the issuing of FPN. So certainly by into next year, then there shouldn't be anybody that's issuing has any kind of a delay in issuing fixed payment notices.
It's a great example of how investment in ICT can really move things forward, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's been a great changer certainly in terms of efficiency and accuracy.
Yeah. The Draeger machines, then, can we just get an update on the Draegers and testing? Or
me? Right, Commissioner, will I go ahead and take that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. And again, yes, Valerie, just to reiterate what others had said, thank you for those positive comments in terms of the work that's been done. And maybe just to give you some operationalising what Andrew had said there in terms of the roads policing and detections. If you look at our performance, perhaps in relation to learner unaccompanied FCNs, that has improved this year to date by 48%. Mm-hmm. And we put that down to the fact that our members can input it straight away. There's no delay in inputting the detection. So we are seeing, in terms of our lifesaver offences and other detections in roads policing, the benefit of that, not just across roads policing. In terms of community policing, a third now of our community policing members have the mobility device as well, and that's where we're looking at the different apps. So there, now in community policing, we're doing what we did with roads policing and saying what apps we need, and they're working to develop the apps that they need for community policing.
Okay, can I move on?
In terms of Draeger devices? Oh, yeah. Draeger devices then. Yes, our Draeger devices then, we work very closely with the Medical Bureau for Road Safety. Mm-hmm. So at both strategic level and then at operational level, we meet. So I meet and with the Chief Superintendent of Roads Policing, with Professor Cusack quarterly, and then underneath that with some operational meetings. And why I reference those is that they bring us the assurance and the really good partnership working that we need in this area. So for example, when we saw the increase in detections of drug driving, we negotiated with the Medical Bureau for Road Safety to release 43 Draeger devices to become operational. Yeah. And we now have them operational, not within Garda stations. In terms of the procurement and for new devices, that actually is for the Medical Bureau of Road Safety, but they do seek our views on what, and have sought our views as part of the consultation process of what will be considered going forward. But I think, we're all agreed that we do need due governance and accountability and be able to record what we're doing. And in support of that new procurement and what we need to do going forward, we are looking at a trend analysis so we can give an estimate to the Medical Bureau of Road Safety what equipment, and even in terms of mouthpieces, that we will need for the new equipment going forward. So we're going to do an evidence-based trend analysis on our previous performance and where actually our trajectory is taking us, because we are seeing that increase in drug driving.
Drug driving, okay.
Drug driving.
Drug as well as drink, okay.
Yeah.
And I think maybe lots of members of the public mightn't be yet aware of the test, that drug testing is happening on the ground. So it's no harm to put out a reminder there, I suppose, today. One last question, because I know we're out of time. Very quick question. In the whole, Commissioner, maybe for yourself, in the whole exercise following the Crowe-Haworth review, I heard a term lately, culture is caught, not taught. Do you think any positive cultural changes were caught in this exercise?
Well, I think in part the technology, if you get it right, hardwires in the appropriate behaviours. And I've seen that with other applications as well. And we increasingly see it, even the processes that we have in terms of GISC, and the thoroughness of their approach in terms of the recording of incidents on the pulse, it hardwires in the positive behaviours. So, and therefore then creates a standard. And I think anything then which accelerates any of these processes that are a criminal justice process is to be very much welcomed as well. But, technology can be very positive in effect steering you in the right direction as well. And I think it has made a real difference there. And, the difficulties that led to Crowe-Haworth and all of that have been very comprehensively dealt with. And I think we're in a far better place. So again, even the doubt there might be that that might exist in terms of continuation of these practices has been resolved through the work that you've heard and you're very aware of, obviously.
Okay, I think we leave it there for now. Thank you very much, Commissioner. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Commissioner. And moving on to the next theme on this afternoon's agenda, and that is the Anti-Corruption Unit. And Elaine Byrne, Authority Member Elaine Byrne, is going to lead the questioning on this.
Thank you, Chair. To begin, I wish to congratulate you, Commissioner, on establishing an anti-corruption unit. You're the first Commissioner to get this across the line, and this is no small achievement given the context It must be acknowledged in the context of various tribunals of inquiry, official inquiries, which made adverse findings against the Gardaí regarding behaviour, internal culture and practices. It must also be congratulated in the context that Greco, the group states on corruption, called for an anti-corruption strategy 2 decades ago now, in 2001. And finally, that the Gardaí have been an outlier across many comparable police services in not having an anti-corruption unit. So this is a very positive development, as noted in the recent Garda Inspectorate report on corruption. So I wanted to congratulate you on establishing the anti-corruption unit. And essentially my questions over the next 20 minutes or so focus on how you intend to practically implement the cultural change and make the various anti-corruption policies living documents. And my concern is, how do you make these nice, lovely policies meaningful, and that this is not just a box ticking exercise? And these concerns echo those made in the Garda Inspector report. So my first question is, what do you hope to achieve in the next 6 to 12 months? What will the anti-corruption unit, the ACU, look like in 6 to 12 months' time?
Well, we have a series of recommendations that we've received from the inspectorate, as you say. We announced this ourselves, the approach that we were taking in May of 2019, and then the inspectors commenced their work in the autumn of 2019. So really, as we were getting going, we had also, in effect, what was a very helpful intervention as well by the inspectorate, and they worked in tandem with us and what we wanted to do, and in effect, they provided us recommendations which are a really solid foundation for us both in the short, medium and long term. And I think really what we want to do in the first 12 months is set the foundations in place about how this is going to impact upon behaviours. You're right to say we're an outlier. Certainly an policing organisation this size, not having an anti-corruption unit, it would be very unusual. Corruption and within an organisation, a policing organisation, is not tolerable. It eats away at public trust and legitimacy of a policing organisation. And we in Garda Síochána are no different from any other policing service in that weakness in not having an anti-corruption unit. But part of what I want to do is really just make sure that the ethical and behavioural environment within which we work is the correct one. We've set out our code of ethics, and now we're following through with very clear behavioural standards that we require from both members and staff of Garda Síochána. Part of this is about public confidence, but also one has to bear in mind we're a policing organisation. We're also a security service. We hold very sensitive information, personal information, crime information, and other national security information. And I and everyone in this organisation is under an obligation to protect that information, because that is integral to how well we do our job, and one in protecting the state, and also then the prevention, detection of crime, and all that is set out in Garda Síochána Act of 2005. So, but at the outset also, we've always said this is about prevention, this is about deterrence, but it's also about promoting positive behaviour in the workplace, supporting those who do report wrongdoing, but also then being sure that it's just not seen as a punitive approach, that actually the standards that we set out are those that people in the organisation aspire to, and that positive peer pressure has a deterrent and preventive effect and promotes positive behaviours within the organisation. Regrettably, in cases of serious misconduct, one has to then take a view on that and look at the facts. But all of those then are decided within process, within discipline processes, which are clearly outlined at the moment. They're quite extensive processes, and those are under review. And I think those will assist going forward in terms of maintaining the very highest standards of honesty and conduct within the organisation. And I think the public have every expectation that when they deal with a member or a staff member of Garda Síochána, that they're going to be dealing with a person that in effect they can trust implicitly in what can often be very vulnerable and difficult circumstances. And I want to meet that expectation that the public quite rightly have of us. So there's a lot of very practical things that we've set out in terms of our response to the inspector. Those are underway in terms of the staffing, but also then in respect of the capabilities that we have, and also then backing up our policies that we've already introduced with more policies that we would wish to put in place. But also then we've had government support in respect of drug testing, and that'll bring us to a position similar with other employers such as Defence Forces, where we have drug testing underpinned by legislation. And I think all of those are very important elements for us as well. But in the first place, it's about the ethical sort of framework and behaviour framework within which we operate. And again, I would always promote the positive behaviours that we expect, and that an ACU is there as a deterrence, as prevention, but also at times to provide advice as well, particularly around some of the difficult ethical dilemmas that we might face. And it's entirely appropriate for a policing organisation, certainly one of our scale, that we would invest in an anti-corruption unit.
What would you say to Gardaí who may be reluctant to engage with the ACU? I know that some of the Garda representative bodies have raised some concerns.
Well, I think part of this is something new, and I know that AC Clavan has spent a lot of time in terms of explanation to the specific associations and unions, and I'll turn to Pat just very shortly. But I would say to everyone in the organisation, the public have a right, and it's an implicit right, that members of this organisation who are invested with powers, very significant powers, and even staff within this organisation who have extraordinary access to information, that they have absolute trust in us. And within that, then it's entirely explicit for me that I ensure that trust is well founded. And this is part of doing that. We took big step forwards in terms of having a code of ethics and the training, etc., that went in place with that. But now this is the next step where we make it very clear what the entirely unacceptable behaviours are, and then what the acceptable behaviours are, conversely then what the acceptable behaviours are as well. So if it wasn't clear to people before what is unacceptable and what can in effect get you into big trouble, then there should be no in effect ignorance of what we regard, what I and what senior managers in the organisation regard as being the absolute necessary behaviours, and those then also behaviours which are not tolerable. We've set that out in terms of involvement in such things as trying to obtain sexual gain through the coercive authority that a member of Garda Síochána would hold. And regrettably, we have instances of that. These are very serious matters. They completely undermine trust in the organisation, and quite often this is directed towards an individual who's come to Garda Síochána looking for help at a time of vulnerability. So that behaviour is entirely unacceptable, and we just have to spell that out. It's regretted that we have to do that, it should be obvious, but there can be no excuses when we introduce these policies as to the behaviour which is in effect not tolerable within the organisation, which we regard properly then as being serious misconduct. If it's okay, I'm going to turn to Pat just in terms of his engagement and ongoing engagement with the associations and unions, please.
Okay, so since last autumn, we have been engaged with the unions and associations in terms of the policies, and we had good discussions with them December, January, up to and including March, and we came to a point that we published the overarching anti-corruption policy. We published the professional boundaries and abuse of power for sexual gain policies and procedures, and we published the drugs policy to put the organisation on notice that we intend to begin the process of drug testing 6 months after that policy was published. And we had a formal launch on the 1st of June in Kevin Street, Garda Station. In order to get back into discussions with the associations, we have met them recently, and there is a difficulty. We have to acknowledge that they indicated that they have a dispute with us. I am absolutely convinced of their bona fides. I'm convinced that they want to make our organisation a better organisation, because they have told us that. All of them have said that they're against the type of behaviours that the Commissioner has just spoken about. And they've all indicated that they intend getting back into an informal process of talks with us. And I can assure you that my team won't be found wanting in that regard. The only difficulty we're having at the moment is trying to find a date that's mutually convenient with holiday time. But we're convinced that we can get back into it, and that we can, with good will on all sides, that we can resolve it. And indeed, some of the suggestions that we got from the associations, for example, there were well-founded views that legislation was required for mandatory drug testing. And as a result of that, the organisation has made a submission to the department, and the department and the minister have been very supportive of that. And we have also issued an RFT to the marketplace, which is inviting tenders for drug testing for third-party supplier, and those RFTs are due back with us on the 6th of August. So there's a lot of progress, but I would have to say that we have further policies that we wish to discuss with the associations, and they centre around conflict of interest, notifiable associations, business interests, and secondary occupations. And I'm convinced that we can have a useful dialogue with the associations and unions, and that we will take all their genuine concerns on board, and we will try to resolve our issues together.
You mentioned the testing regime for controlled drugs. What is needed to make that testing regime a reality?
We have asked for an enabling piece of legislation, and then that there would be that would allow the minister to make regulations, and that the regulations would provide for the regime as being set out in our procedures document, so that it would set out exactly what would happen. The regulations would be more detailed. Obviously, there would be an enabling piece of primary legislation that would allow the minister to make regulations. And then we would envisage that the minister would make the regulations in harmony with our procedures document.
I want to ask now about the independence of the ACU. And, this is a question every jurisdiction faces: who guards the guardians? In relation to giving the ACU independence within the Garda Síochána, will the ACU be given full organisation responsibility for the prevention, detection and investigation of corruption as recommended by the Garda inspectors? And can you put a date on that?
Yes, obviously this is going to be an evolutionary process. For example, AC O'Driscoll's people very often conduct serious criminal investigations that might touch on the business that you would expect an ACU to be dealing with. And obviously we will grow the intelligence and investigative capability of the newly established anti-corruption unit over time. It's not something that we're going to, we're not going to take over all investigations that are currently being handled by AC O'Driscoll's people overnight. We're going to do this on a gradual basis. But that's the intention. The intention would be that the anti-corruption unit would be responsible for the areas that you're talking about.
So other than an evolutionary process, you've no timeline, whether it's going to be 6 months, 12 months or 2 years or?
Well, we have a very detailed set of timelines in response to the inspector report, and the Commissioner sent his response to the Minister. We're working closely with the department, and we've shared that with yourselves, and we've had discussions with yourselves on it. So that's essentially where we are at the moment.
And will the ACU have full visibility of all ongoing criminal and discipline investigations into members of the Garda workforce? And if so, when?
that's something that again is being developed. As you can imagine, the ACU is part of governance and accountability, and another area of my responsibility is the internal affairs division within the Garda Síochána, and we have arrangements made that appropriate access to systems are being made available to the anti-corruption unit.
I suspect your answer to the next question is similar. I mean, how will the ACU, for instance, work with the organised and serious crime units, and what would happen if allegations are made against members of the NBCI, the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation?
Well, obviously, we would make sure that there's an independence of investigation. The organisation will have the capability of investigating allegations of wrongdoing, no matter where they are, and will be capable of investigating no matter where the members are attached to.
With regard to the reporting of wrongdoing, which is a recommendation within the Garda Inspector's report, are you satisfied that Gardaí and staff are provided with sufficient encouragement to do so?
I suppose one would never be fully satisfied, but I'm satisfied that we're making due efforts, that we're providing them with a dedicated email address, a dedicated helpline, and that we're about to engage with a third-party provider in terms of them making disclosures to that third-party provider.
So an email address, a third-party provider, and
a dedicated telephone for ourselves, and indeed they can write to us, and some people do write to us indeed.
One of the wonderful things in having delayed in introducing an ACU is that we can learn from other jurisdictions, and having a blank sheet in effect allows the ACU to see the mistakes and the successes of other jurisdictions. And in that regard, I note that one of the key recommendations of the UK report by Greco, the Group States on Corruption into Policing, touches on what you envisage the response to be to supporting Gardaí who have concerns about reporting of wrongdoing. And that recommendation noted that, within the UK jurisdiction, that they also have lovely, nice policies on anti-corruption and wrongdoing. But the Greco report noted that there was no clearly predefined signposted procedure for police officials to obtain confidential advice in the case of integrity and ethical dilemmas. And in that case, they called for not just emails or third-party providers, but actual properly trained people of trust in police units to provide confidential advice on integrity and ethical issues.
Sorry, in terms of what you just said, we have begun rolling out of training, and the blended learning training approach includes a policing expert from another jurisdiction, from Scotland, and he would say that he started about maybe 12 odd years ago, and he would say that we are starting in a very healthy position, that we are fortunate, if you like, that I suppose we have a lot to learn from neighbouring jurisdictions, and he's actually very happy with the approach that we're taking. And we've delivered that training so far to about half of our senior managers, both Gardaí and Garda staff, and we will resume that in September. So we do intend addressing the issue that you're talking about in terms of advice and support, and it's something that we'll constantly be fine-tuning and learning. And indeed, I'm aware that we're going to have a Greco evaluation that's commencing in October, and I'm sure that there's much to learn from that process.
Can you provide us with a time frame as regards publication of the addendum on protected disclosure?
All I can say is, as recently as this morning, it's imminent. It's just not there yet. There's ongoing discussions. It's ready to go. It has been approved by the Garda executive, but there's just a little bit of extra preparatory work that needs to be done. But it's imminent. We had hope for, our target was the end of July. The end of July is on Saturday. I can't say we'll make that or not, but it's imminently about to go.
Are you satisfied that this addendum is sufficient for your purposes?
I am, and the Garda executive is satisfied, and I think it was the Commissioner's own idea, and it was a good idea. And of course, the whole area of protected disclosures is something that we'll always be looking at on the basis of the wider public service experience.
One of the milestones of the ACU, the anti-corruption strategy, is the development of what's known as the intelligence and investigation section of the unit. What's your vision as to when that will be operational and your vision for it in practice?
So we've already started building our intelligence capacity, and we have started with a small investigative capacity, which we hope to build on. We are bidding for extra resources that we expect to be in a stronger position to have addressed next year rather than this year. We're at about 28 odd members of Síochána, from Chief Superintendent down to Garda, and we're about to have 5 Garda staff allocated to the unit, and we're also approved for a Garda analyst. We recognise the benefit of an analyst to the work we do. So we're building our capacity.
Are you happy with your resources?
Would there ever be a police leader who would say that they're happy with their resources? I'm making my strongest case possible for as many as possible, but I also recognise the environment that we currently operate in terms of the numbers that are hemorrhaging from the organisation and the challenges in recruitment and promotion. Like particularly at sergeant and inspector level, there's huge challenges there at the moment, and I recognise that.
I mean, would it be a concern? I mean, I understand that COVID, of course, was a public health emergency, but would there be a concern that a pledging organisation, its numbers would hemorrhage because they're pulled here and there because of various emergencies or various other priorities? Is there a commitment to ring fencing the resources that you have?
I don't know about ring fencing, but I know that our people were sent out in January, and that was in a really difficult circumstance. And we're very grateful to the people who went out willingly to assist with their frontline colleagues. They all come back in March, and to the extent possible, we have gotten the people in that we had looked for. So I'm happy that in these challenging times that we have gotten really good resources and very capable people and very willing people, and I'm happy that we are as far on as we are. We had another challenge, which was our building is being prepared for us at the moment. I'm happy to report that we should be occupying that in the early part of the fourth quarter of the year. They're in temporary accommodation at the moment. This is their second temporary move, but I'm happy that that's been done, and I'm also happy that in terms of transport and ICT equipment, we're getting really good support from the organisation.
One of the key criticisms of the Garda Inspectorate report looked at, as I call them, the nice lovely policies, one of which was on conflict of interest. Where are you at as regards practically implementing and publishing guidelines on the declaration, recording and management of conflicts of interests? Hello? Can you hear me, or is it that you can't hear?
I think Pat is frozen, Commissioner. Maybe somebody else can take that question.
The conflict of interest policy, from my knowledge, is in this second suite of policies now that we wish to work through. Pat has talked about the work that is ongoing with the unions and the associations. So that's in the second suite of policies that we wish to address. I think that in the first suite we wanted just to, in effect, set out our stall around the anti-corruption piece, but then set out the 2 areas where we're particularly concerned. One was around drug misuse, and then the other one was really misuse of the Office of Guard in respect of sexual gain. So that's why those 2 policies came first. But as you can see from the report, there's other policies then to follow through So that'll be this year, but I don't know the specific time scale of those.
And my final question is to you, Garda Commissioner. It's kind of a general question, but what do you see as the key challenges facing the implementation of the policies that you've produced to date?
Well, part of this it's not even just about the anti-corruption unit. It's about the culture of behaviours and what's acceptable behaviour within the organisation. There's only one tool towards this. The second part of that is the code of ethics. But a third sort of very important piece is a leadership and example that's set by all supervisors and all those in the organisation in a position of influence, and that's Garda members and Garda staff. And so it's the acceptance then of these are the standards that we've set. The standards are absolutely critical to the success and effect of the policing mission. And there needs to be more, I would say, done around the communication of this and the understanding of it amongst not just the senior ranks, but also middle ranks within the organisation as well. So that's an important element of this. And I do sort of come back to the point there that this will work best if it's not seen so much as being punitive, but just actually the way we are and people are responding in effect to the peer pressure of the good behaviour you see around them, and actually then poor behaviour is called out. And I do have to say we are in a position where people do call out what they regard to be poor behaviour, and that's just not in an anonymous sense. People are calling out poor behaviour and standing over witness accounts that they're given in respect of that, and indeed in respect of some serious incidents. So there are already very positive behaviours in the organisation, and what we just want to do is to make sure that the organisation recognises that, supports it and promotes it throughout in terms of all of its members and staff.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to AC Pat-Gavin, who's back. Sorry, we lost you for a moment, but and thank you for your input to that. Is there, Commissioner, an echo of the initial slow start in respect to the Code of Ethics, which has become, it would appear to us, much more central, much more embedded in the life of the organisation now, and nobody seems, not only does nobody raise an eyebrow in relation to it, but everybody seems to embrace it as a valuable and important part of the organisational culture? Well,
I think that that's part of it. Also, the other thing I would highlight too is just the increase in human rights focus in the organisation. The 600 that we've trained on a police-specific human rights training course this year. The further, I think it's another 600 that we're training then in the autumn, and then we hope to deliver it again. And so, that is human rights training specific to policing purpose, and a lot of that touches upon the human rights of individuals that come into contact with the police, and the need then for a very high standard of behaviour in response, and ethical behaviour in response to that, if we're to meet our human rights obligations as well. So there's other important things happening which are driving this conversation. The ACU is a bit of a spear point in this, but there's a lot of other things that are important to highlight. And as I've said, leadership's important, human rights framework's important, and the Code of Ethics. And in many places, 100%, in effect, sign up to the Code of Ethics, and also the individual conversations with those who have yet to sign up. All of these are, I think, positive indicators in respect of where the culture of the organisation is moving, and that's good in the short, medium, and long term. I would say, in particular, to Pat and his team, very good work has been done in developing these policies, and they have cast a net wide in terms of the learning in other organisations, and that's clear just from the quality of the work that's been done. And also then that we're able to put drug testing on a legislative basis is also a very important intervention as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we're going to move on to the next and final item in this public session, which is the CAD 999 emergency calls, and it will be recalled that we devoted considerable time to this at the public meeting in June. And I think it might be desirable in my brief introductory comments on this session, simply to recall for the public, those of us who are in this meeting are very familiar with the details, but to recall the fact that in the period under review, which was 2019 and most of 2020, there were 1.4 million calls made to the Garda Síochána on 999, 2999 calls. And in the review that was undertaken beginning towards the end of last year, more than 200,000, around 203,000 were identified as having been closed or cancelled, as the colloquial use has it, incorrectly or inappropriately. And of that 203,000, about 1 in 8 were in the emergency or priority 1 category. And that's about 23,000 calls. And of those, about 1 in 7 related to domestic violence and sexual abuse in their initial categorization. And that comes to just over 3,000. Now, in the first stage of the review of all of these issues, the Garda Síochána added missing persons and health emergency calls to those, which brought the number to just short of 6,000, 5,871. And these are the calls which have been the subject of very detailed and which I described previously in a communication with the Minister as being painstakingly cautious. They relate specifically to that set of, or subset of the priority 1 calls. This is a lengthy process that faces the Garda Síochána to find a way to review the remainder of the priority 1 calls and to look at ways in which there can be reassurance about the lower priority calls, some of which may be very significant in themselves. And the authority will maintain and retain and sustain its interest in this until the end. There were references earlier in this meeting to aspects of the breath test and fixed penalty notices of a number of years ago. And some of that conversation is still unfolding 4 or 5 years on. Same was true in relation to the issue of the homicide review. And so too, I think it will be in relation to this. There is a significant amount of work, lengthy, but absolutely vital, to be undertaken by the Garda Síochána, overseen by the policing authority, in relation to having a clear sense of and as detailed an understanding as can realistically be expected of the issues that arose and of the circumstances that existed within those incorrectly closed or cancelled engagements. At the last public meeting, we said that we would look to identify an independent source who would offer reassurance and offer advice and offer insights into the work that's being undertaken by the Garda Síochána. And it's not the purpose of this to halt the work being undertaken by the Garda Síochána. On the contrary, it would be this first phase will be brief, as expeditiously dealt with as possible. And the authority has been fortunate to obtain the services and to conclude an agreement with Mr. Derek Penman, who has a long experience of policing in the United Kingdom and who was very particularly relevant to this task, the head of the Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland for more than 4 years. And he has begun his work, and he will be coming. There have been several meetings with him already, and he will be beginning his engagements with the Garda Síochána early next week. The task that the authority is is setting him is intended principally to be one of reassurance to the authority itself, to the Commissioner, but very, very particularly to the public, that all of these issues are being dealt with effectively, that the approach being taken by the Garda Síochána is the appropriate one, that there will be consistency in the identification of any adverse consequences that flowed from any of these cancelled or inadequately attended calls. Also, to look at the extent to which the remaining calls in priority 1 can be dealt with, and of identifying an approach to the handling of the substantial body of cancelled calls that arose in respect of the priority 2 and priority 3 issues. I think that issues also that will be covered in this preliminary view will be the question of the approach to the performance management and how that can be dealt with in all of its manifestations and in all of its characteristics. It is, as I said, significant work, important, critically important to reassure the public, to ensure that the confidence of the public in the Garda Síochána itself, but also in the efficacy and reliability and ever-presence of the emergency call system is absolutely crystal clear to everybody, and is as strong as everybody would want it to be. Very considerable work has been undertaken by the Garda Síochána. We've noted that in the past, and as I said, considerable work still to be done. And I know the Commissioner wants to make some initial remarks for this afternoon, and then Shalom Binchy is going to lead the questioning on this particular item.
Thank you, Chair. And you've obviously set out the statistical background of this, but there's a few things I'd like to emphasise. That one, there's good work and genuinely good work being done in divisions in terms of victim engagement, and it's very appropriate and professional engagement with all those who have been affected by this review. And I've been to divisions and seen this for myself, and every case and every situation that you see is somewhat different. Each of them is unique, and there is very good engagement between the members of Garda Síochána who are dealing with this and then the victims that they're meeting. And in most of the cases, this has been a very positive exercise in reconnecting and then following through in terms of either support or indeed in some cases subsequent investigation. So we want to make sure that all necessary action is taken in terms of crime investigation, but also then support services that we can provide, but also then that Pulse is properly uploaded and brought up to date as well. And that is ongoing at this moment in time. We too welcome, and we'd like to say we welcome the appointment of Mr. Derek Penman, and we look forward then to working with Mr. Penman then over the next few weeks in terms of just the work that we've undertaken and assisting him fully in his examination and reporting on this matter. And the last thing I would wish to say at this moment is that we are still committed to the victims, very obviously committed to the victims of domestic abuse, and I would continue to appeal to any person who may have been a victim of abuse or knows of a family member or friend who is a victim of such abuse, that information is important to us, and I really make an appeal that they do make contact with us and contact Garda Síochána. We have put huge investment in terms of our protective service units. We have, in effect, refocused again on domestic abuse through Obfusif, which ran very successfully throughout the year. And last year, we saw a considerable uplift in terms of prosecution of offences, and also then breach of barring orders. And we want to carry on that work. And I want to make it just very clear that we still remain deeply committed to the victims of domestic abuse and just would want to reiterate that appeal that if you are a victim or you know if someone is a victim, please reach out and seek assistance. Thank you, Chair. Mute, Chair.
So I know, Commissioner. Thank you for that. And handing over now to Shalom.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, could I just start by maybe asking you to briefly outline to us what stage this phase of the review is at? Can you hear me? Oh, sorry.
Yes. Sorry, took me a second to unmute there. Sorry. We have now identified 5,871 incidents that's been referred to. So they are of really those priority one closed incidents. A proportion of those, over 4,000, relate to domestic abuse scenarios. 1,400 health, and missing persons 310. And what we're doing is working through those, seeing which were in effect had a valid closure. Some of those, has to be said, are mainly duplicate calls, and there's almost 2,700 of those. And therefore then we had a further assessment then of the invalid closures, and of that then further 2,800 were confirmed as being invalid. An assessment then is conducted at a regional level, and some 1,360 of those cases have then been given out to divisions to do work. Obviously, DMR is very prominent in that, and DMR North, DMR West will have 170, 200 apiece. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the bigger urban divisions, but every division has had some to do. So far, we've completed of that 1,360. 1,239. Now, each of those will require, the 2,860, which were invalidly closed, either as cancelled or for information, they do require a pulse incident. And so it's the pulse incidents that we create will give us the greatest insight into this. So far, we've created 395 pulse incidents, and that reveals them which are non-crime and crime. And so that work is ongoing as well. So I would say we've made good progress in terms of victim caller follow-up. There's still some to do. Still some actually defined, and some individuals have been difficult actually to locate. They may have left the jurisdiction. So that is nearly complete. Now we must work in respect of the pulse update. And that's ongoing, and some of this then will reveal crime incidents, and where that does then be reported then into the Director of Public Prosecutions. A lot of this also relates to non-crime incidents. We don't seek to diminish those because a proportion of those will relate to domestic abuse, non-crime, but that also may reveal incidents where referrals should have been made to TUSLA, and that's certainly a feature of what I've seen out in divisions where there were children in a place where there was some form of domestic disturbance. Might I also say that some of these calls relate to disturbances in a domestic setting and wouldn't fall in perhaps to the traditional view of domestic violence scenario, but where there were difficult circumstances, maybe a teenage child was being particularly difficult, and people called the guards, parents called the guards in effect to help them with what was a pretty fraught situation. No crime disclosed, but there should have been a referral to TUSLA. So those are the type of issues that we are finding, uncovering, and from what I've seen myself and to what I can see from the processes adopted, it is painstaking, but it is very thorough, and the individual members I was talking to have a very detailed knowledge of each of the incidents, what happened, and what the circumstances of the particular victim or caller are at this moment, and how we can further assist them.
Can you give us an idea of the numbers, say, for the victims that are yet to be called? How many roughly do you think are outstanding?
there's 121 where there's further victim follow-up required, and that's out of 1,360. So pushing down towards 8%. The difficulties just has been in identifying where they are now and making contact, and we're having then to go to other agencies to try and locate these individuals, and some are outside the jurisdiction. At this moment, we're aware of that, and so it's doubtful we will be able to do a follow-up there, but some we've yet to find.
Okay, and you mentioned there that there have been, arising from your reviews so far, that there have been some investigations. How many investigations have arisen from this review? So
of the pulse incidents so far created, and this is the best guide of this, there's 395 pulse incidents have been created, of which 13% were crime incidents. So if we extrapolate those numbers out to 2,860, we're talking probably 400 crime incidents that we'll have to investigate.
So these are 400 crime incidents that wouldn't have been investigated were it not for this review?
That's correct. And the large proportion of those are in respect of minor assault, but we are still, that's an extrapolation on my part at the moment. We've created 395 pulse incidents, 13% of which were crime. So if that multiplies out, but it can be in the figure, it may be higher than that, it may be lower, but it's going to be in the region of between 400 and 500 at the higher end.
And just to be clear, the review that's taking place at the moment is a review of calls between the 1st of January 2019 and the 31st of October 2020. Is that right? That's correct, yes. And the calls that we're talking about now, they represent 5,871 out of a total of 202,931 cancelled calls during that period. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. But this group have been picked because of our particular concern as to the risk and the ongoing risk that there may be to individuals. So there's a very specific reason why this 5,870 were selected. No, I appreciate that. And that 500,871, they're a small portion of the priority one calls. And just to be clear, priority one calls are burglaries, assaults, sexual assaults, and domestic violence type calls. Is that a fair categorization? I think 5871 from, if I might have looked to Andrew, who can give me the overall figure there for the priority one calls and define them a little bit. The number I have is 23,361. So Andrew might confirm that if it's correct.
That's correct, Siobhan. That's a combination of priority one and priority E, which are usually involve weapons or threats to life. But that's E is the highest priority. Priority one is the lowest. Of the 5871, none of those will include emergencies. They didn't meet that threshold. So they're all priority one. The 5871 across those categories you've listed.
Thank you, Andrew. And can I just ask then, Commissioner, what is the plan in terms of reviewing the remainder of the priority one calls?
Well, I think for our part, we put huge effort into this. There will be learning for us whenever we work through the pulse incidents, and then we'll want to review priority one calls to see what areas there we still believe there's attendant risk. Given the nature of some of the calls which fall within priority one, there's not the same policies or procedures in respect of them because the attendant risk is not an ongoing one. So for instance, for serious road traffic collision, for instance, that collision will have happened. Gardaí will have attended with other emergency services and the incident will have been dealt with, but we may have found that a lot of our cancellations are in effect repeat calls or duplicate calls. So we'll look into that group and we'll have a learning from what we've done here to see where the next batch is which is worthy of attention. But there is learning coming out of this.
But do you plan to review them?
sorry to interrupt. Do you plan to review them in some way, shape or form?
Well, there will be work, but it's whether we take a representative batch and then what batch we actually take. Some of these incidents, going back to 2019, and given the type, if you have an incident of public disturbance, well, that public disturbance will have long passed. And what is the value then in going back into such incidents? The reason we're going back into these incidents is the attendant risk which may be carrying on. So we have to adopt a risk-based approach. There's 200,000 there. We can't possibly review all those. And I know that's not being suggested. So at the same time, then we need to make sure that those that we do select, we are doing that against an agreed or a rationale of examination for some purpose, because we believe there's actually something to follow through on. But I would highlight that the policy around these and our procedure were strict, and that's what gives us a particular concern where that has not been applied.
No, I appreciate that, but how are you going to actually risk assess the remainder of those calls? What will that risk assessment look like? Well,
I'd have to say that has to be determined yet. As I said, we want to learn from this process and then see what we do next. There's a very considerable amount of work left in this. It is drawn in a lot of resources. They want to learn from this, and then before we move on to, in effect, the next stage of this.
And is there any plan whatsoever in relation to priority 2 and 3 calls and a review or risk assessment of those calls?
Well, again, we still have to apply the same rationale. So what would be the ongoing risk? What's the value here? And probably what are the learning points? Certainly, it's worthy of examination. But these, as I say, where we've concentrated in this 5871 is because we see risk may be ongoing, and we have found that. And I think that's been appropriate. We put our efforts here, do this work properly, and then see where we move to next.
And I'm just going to return to one of the first questions I asked then. What is the time frame for completion for the first stage of the review? I know you've said you're getting near the end, and there's 121 victims left to be called, but when do you think that phase might be actually, in terms of a date, when do you think that might be completed?
Well, I would say that 121 number will probably, if it reduces, it's going to reduce slowly, because it is requiring significant work to locate individuals. The next piece then is the uploading onto Pulse, and I don't want to just say, oh, that'll be finished by the end of August. I think just the month that we have ahead of us and the amount of demands upon us, etc. But there is a number of weeks of work left in that. I suppose if I ask Andrew, is there any time scale in terms of the implementation around that you're saying, Andrew?
Yeah, that's probably about right, Commissioner. It's the order of weeks, not months. So it may go a little bit past the end of August, but it shouldn't be much past that. I'd say sometime in September that should be complete. And just the other point to note is that while the groundwork has all largely been done, as you said, there's not very much left to do. The collation of the information to make sure that the other learnings, as well as the ones the Commissioner highlighted there, that's going to take a little bit longer as well. But again, it's not long. I mean, most of the work is done. So to correctly record all of the crime and non-crime incidents out of the 2860, probably around the end of August, early September, and then the collation of the data, maybe a little bit longer than that, towards the end of September.
Okay. And can I ask you, Commissioner, is there any reason to believe that the inappropriate cancellation of calls was confined solely to the period under review, or is it reasonable to assume that the cancellation was going on particularly before those dates and possibly afterwards?
Whenever this was found in October, there was quick action taken in terms of procedure in the control rooms, and that brought that in. I think the last month in our presentation, we set out where the cancellation and for information rates were, and cancellation can be an appropriate closure of an incident, and I think we have brought that level down. The difficulty prior to 2019 is that the CAD system was not universal across the organisation, and so we can have no sight into what was happening before that. It's the fact that the CAD system had rolled out across the whole organisation gives us then the ability then to focus in on this particular period.
Okay. I suppose, would it be fair to say then that there's no reason to believe that it wasn't happening before that?
It may well have been, but it's in part it's speculation in that we've no way of validating it.
Okay. When we spoke last, Commissioner, you identified that there were a number of outliers, as you described them, and that's how you described the call takers or dispatchers who cancelled a disproportionate number of calls. And you said at our last meeting that you were going to seek an explanation for this. Can I ask you, have you been furnished with an explanation at this stage?
The examination of that is still ongoing, and I think that in part is part of the analysis then that we'll want to do as the timescale has been set out here in September. It isn't perhaps just quite as straightforward as it might seem, and some of what we want to learn from the analysis of this is just the decision making and the rationales applied. It has to be said, like in the great majority of these, there were many either members or there were multiple members and staff engaged, because it did engage first the individual took the call, but then also then the dispatchers, and there could have been several dispatchers engaged, and also then those members then who attended the call itself. So it hasn't proven to be just a simple exercise to say those individuals that look like outliers. There's actual cause and effect that you can just easily identify, but it's part of the examination. We're very much aware of it, but also then we want to be clear about the behaviours that are ongoing at the moment as well, in respect of how matters are being closed off, and also then the impact of the additional training that we've provided to those in the control room staff.
And you mentioned there that the guards dealing with the incident are involved. Have you discovered that some guards were instructing the cancellation of calls?
In which way is this the suggestion that there's WhatsApp groups advising this?
Well, there's that, but also at some stage it was mentioned to us that the individual guards may have been instructing for calls to be cancelled. That's something that you've come across on your review?
Well, the allegation that was made, certainly when I've spoken to divisional officers in respect to this, so the chief superintendents, they're not able to bear that out, and they have a specific discipline responsibility for their members, and they weren't seeing that, and that's in the the busiest divisions where if there were such patterns of behaviour, there's most likely to be a parent there. But if look to Anne-Marie, there's anything there you might add on that, Anne-Marie?
Thanks, Commissioner. So I suppose it's important to remember that when the call is dispatched, it goes to the patrol car or the guard who is responding. And depending on what that guard finds at the scene, he or she may say that there's no incident here, or there isn't anything, or we've checked the area, we've knocked on the door of the house, we've got no reply, and that would be fed back. So that response may trigger a closure.
But was there any inappropriate direction to close from the guards who were responding? So
what we have found is, in terms of some of the calls that we didn't. So, for example, in domestic violence situations, where a caller may call in and then maybe make a subsequent call to the control room and say there's no need to come, everything's under control, everything is fine. So in that type of situation, in accordance with our policy, we should still go to that call. In some instances, we didn't do that. We accepted the call. We prematurely closed the call as opposed to going and finding out. So it's non-adherence to policy is a big part of it. And as has been alluded to already, our policy in respect of domestic violence is very strict. So the fact
that policy is there to protect against a situation where somebody might be, for example,
absolutely
under the control of another person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why even if somebody does ring in, we shouldn't accept that. We should still go check out and establish the facts. So yes, there's been non-adherence to policy in terms of some closures.
May I ask you one more question when you're there, Deputy Commissioner? Were any of these so-called outliers, were any Gardaí responders identified as outliers? And what I mean by that were there any individual Gardaí who had a disproportionate number of cancellations along the lines of what you've just described?
Well, as the Commissioner has outlined, this is an ongoing process, and it's quite nuanced in terms of how the calls were closed. So, but at this point in time, we have not established any recurring themes or outliers, as you put it, in the context of the particular question you asked.
Okay, so when outliers were identified, and I might go back to the Commissioner for this, that was within the call taking and call dispatching units, was it?
Yes, and in part, and this is why this requires further analysis, because some dispatchers are very industrious in terms of opening up the incidents, and whether they do anything else other than the opening up and look at it and see what's happening, and then that's subsequently cancelled. So we don't want to be in a position where individuals are being penalised because they're keeping a very close eye on the work that is sitting in a particular division. And in fairness, I would expect the dispatchers to have an intimate knowledge of the work that's ongoing at any moment in time, because in effect they may have to make a choice about drawing a mobile or a patrol away from one incident to send it to another. So some of the product of the what I previously termed as outliers has also been a signal of how many incidents that they engaged themselves in, which just may have been simply no more than to open and review that incident and take no other action then to close it. It's not a question that they actually cancelled it. It may be just that they, in effect, touched that incident, reviewed it or whatever it might be, looked at it, got a knowledge of it, and then moved on. And so we just need to be careful of our analysis around this.
Okay, just to be clear there, are you saying that what was previously described as people who had cancelled a disproportionate number of calls, you're saying now that might have been completely appropriate? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's why we want that's why we need the space to actually do the complete analysis.
Okay. But that's quite a U-turn, if you don't mind me saying. Well,
I think we provided the best answers we could on the state of our knowledge at that moment in time. Okay. And as we've got to learn more about this, then more has become apparent around those members of the dispatchers who have been, who've opened up a lot of incidents. And I can understand why they would have done that, because that's in terms of just reviewing what's going on and keeping an eye on the amount of work that's happening in a division and how they're going to use the resources accordingly. So, but the matter is still to be fully fleshed out and reviewed, and the work we're doing and we'll be able to come then to a better conclusion in respect.
Yeah, well, we look forward to seeing that. Has there been any performance review with senior management and the individual call takers and dispatchers? Has that taken place yet?
So I believe that, well, I know there's been individual interaction with the call takers and dispatchers, and that's happened in each of the centres. Maybe, Deputy, have you more detail on that?
Yes, Commissioner. So there's been a series of interventions to, I suppose, support the staff in the control rooms. So at the outset, there was a refreshing of the various HQ directives and policies that govern call taking and our own policies in terms of domestic violence and procedures we are to adopt in that context. So that was done very early on in the time. In addition to that, then there's been one-to-one engagements with the staff, and again, I suppose those engagements are really around the importance of the call-taking function. It's the first interaction that a member of the public has with Garda Síochána. So they've all taken place. In addition to that, there's a training program developed, and that one-day training program is part of a three-prong approach to training that will evolve over the next while. And that one-day training program, it talks about the call taking. It talks about the empathetic approach. We have the negotiators, addressing the group, the importance of that, the crisis situations that people may find themselves in. We also have a mental health expert addressing the group, and we have some scenario based training as well. So it's as comprehensive as it can be given the one day. But so I know that it's been delivered in the DMR, and the other centres are scheduled, and they'll all be done over the coming weeks. In addition to that, then in the medium term, there's a more substantial piece of work going on in terms of looking at other call centres, emergency call centres, ambulance centres, and learning and, I suppose, identifying best practice, and not just within our own country, but also looking at other police forces, including the PSNI. And again, it's all about trying to establish the best possible training programme for our members. And it's important to note as well that when the control room staff were assigned to the control room, there was a very comprehensive training programme. But I suppose organisationally, we didn't repeat or refresh that. So that's a big learning for us as well. So that's what we're going to do, and then in the longer term, then we're going to have completely revise our training program. But there are lots of incremental steps that we're doing.
Has there been any external element to your training so far, and will there be?
Yes, there has. Yes, we've had Dr. Harry Kennedy is addressing in the part of the one-day training program, and that is part of the plan, and that, as I said, that has been delivered already within the DMR. So, and certainly,
am I right in saying the external component is confined to the mental health aspect of call taking?
Yes, at the moment, yeah. But I mean, I suppose it's important to remember that we're looking at this in the three-prong approach in a short, medium and a longer term way. So in the medium term, we will be looking at other emergency services, as I've said, call taking services, and identifying best practice. So we're open to all of that, and it's an ongoing and evolving process. And then in the longer term, obviously, then we'll have more scenario-based training, which I think is very important, really, because it really, I suppose, gets the trainees or the participants to immerse themselves in particular situations. And you know, our ultimate aim and objective in all of this is to provide a responsive, reassuring and reliable service to all callers. And I just like to take this opportunity, you know, just to encourage people to call and Garda Síochána, and we can assure them that their call will be answered, and we will give them that service that they require. That's the really important piece in all of this. And everything we're doing now in this review is making sure and learning from the mistakes that we've made, but also, you know, building on the good practice as well. And equally, I would like to say that the staff in the control rooms right around the country, you know, they deal with a very, very difficult and challenging situations. And you know, time and time again, you know, they talk to people in crisis and do a really good job, albeit that sometimes, you know, as this review has outlined, you know, we weren't 100% right in all our interactions, but our aim is to be, and hopefully into the future, you know, we can guarantee you that and assure the authority around that. And you know, as I've said previously, this review has shone a light in the control rooms. And I suppose it has really brought home to us the importance of that first interaction, you know, with the public, and the importance of having an empathetic, listening and caring ear and response to the public. And really, that's where we want to be into the future. Okay. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. And the Deputy Commissioner has really brought up a few of just the final items that I want to raise. Again, Commissioner, when we spoke before, you acknowledged that there were failings in the quality of the call taking, both in terms of the gathering of relevant information and with the empathy and nature in which the calls were actually taken. So I just wanted to ask whether there has been a root and branch analysis of the call taking from beginning to end, because when some of the authority members, including myself, listened to some of the calls, we identify that there were problems from the very beginning of the call taking, from the ECAS taking of the call and the transfer over to the call takers and call dispatchers. And what I wanted to know was whether this review will encompass a review from the very beginning of the call taking process, from ECAS to the call taker in the regional centres, to the call dispatcher, and then to the Garda response, including the response on the ground, the closure of the file and the transfer of information to Pulse. I mean, is that the type of review that we're talking about? Is it going to be root and branch to make sure that the service is a responsive one and that it's one that's fit for purpose, and that callers get the service that they should expect when they call 999?
Well, I can confirm that as being a definite yes. We are looking at the process, not just, you know, what happened whenever the call was passed on to a mobile, but from their first interaction with ourselves in terms of what that response was necessary, and what the deputy has already set out there in terms of the further training is around the enhancement of the skills and the refreshment of the skills of those who are taking that initial call, and how best then to interact with an individual who's under stress. And very obviously, a lot of the calls that we do receive in the 999 system are respect of those who are in some form of stressful situation, and what the whole process looks like. So by the end of this, we will have listened to all of the calls. That'll give us learning in terms of the quality of those, and then what else we wish to do in terms of improving the performance. And as Debbie set out as well, there is short, medium and longer term. Certainly, we have had to offer assistance from our UK colleagues in respect of their learnings around control room and the approach taken to highly stressful calls, including those from domestic abuse victims. So there's a lot of experience that we can draw on from other places as well, and we intend to do that, yes.
And before you do that, have you looked closer to home? Have you spoken to the people who run the ECAS part of the call, the initial people who answer the call?
I'm not sure we've been in contact with ECAS people. No.
Okay. Is that something that you would consider?
Well, whenever we get to this place of review, they're not directly within my employment, but obviously, if something at the ECAS, if the ECAS centre is, if we have feedback for them, then obviously, then we'll provide that. I suppose the ECAS function is to route it to the appropriate service, and if they're not able to do that, in effect, we then become the service that these calls get routed to. So we do receive calls sometimes that are meant for other emergency services. So, but I suppose the priority for them is to pass it on to the emergency service that can provide
just to be
the
clear,
appropriate service.
The problem that we identified was that transfer was sometimes a little, we thought it might be confusing for the person placing the call. The transfer wasn't very clear. It wasn't explained to the call taker what was happening. And we thought there were some simple remedial measures that might be taken there. And that's why we would ask for that to be, considered as part of the review.
Okay, that's fine. But I think our immediate response to those calls was an area that we identified. And in terms of just, what the opening comments are when somebody comes through to the our control room, those are important comments as well, to set the context for the individual, so they're certain about who they're talking to, and that we're in a position then to receive information from them. So you're correct in identifying that as being, a quick exchange, but a very important exchange.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bob, you're muted.
Bob, you're muted.
I wonder if I could ask. Thank you, Shalom, and thank you, Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, for that engagement, enlightening engagement. I wonder if I could perhaps make one or two observations and also ask one or two brief questions as we draw this particular section of the meeting and the meeting itself to a close. In the first instance, while they are obviously heavily burdened at the moment with in dealing with this issue, the Dublin Metropolitan Region will have access to pre-2019 experiences, and there may be some insights to be obtained from some sample listening back to some calls that predated this particular review to get a sense of whether this had an earlier life, as it were, and not a more recent phenomenon. And the second is that, and I recognise that information on which conclusions are drawn or evaluations are made can change as the information base changes. But in the presentations that I was at in Harcourt Square in relation to the Dublin Metropolitan Region and in Galway in relation to the Northwest, there was a clear sense that those who had been engaging in the review had a clear understanding of the ratio of warranted to unwarranted cancellations or closures that were made by a range of individuals, and that perhaps that has changed, but it seemed quite specific at the time, and that was in May and early June. The two questions I had, Commissioner, was when you raised the question of the value of going back to the remaining priority one issues. Excuse me. Why not for second questioning? Because it was absolutely the right thing to do, to focus initially on those areas where risk may have immediately been apprehended as likely to have arisen or possibly having arisen for individuals or indeed for the evidential base of the organisation. It's difficult to know how one can be certain that there weren't serious issues underlying some of the other closures or cancellations in the priority one areas. And at the very least, one would get a clearer sense of where in the cycle closures were made and whether that represented an issue that needed to be addressed. But if one would assume that because they were priority one cases, that they had the potential at least to have risk attached to them. And that will obviously be an area in which the authority will take particular interest in the advice from Mr. Penman, because that's one of the areas that has been identified in his terms of reference. And the second question, if the first one was a question, is do you think that the elevation of the cancellation to supervisors, effective though it was at the beginning, and really it stopped the problem at the beginning in terms of inappropriate closures or cancellations, do you think that's an effective long-term solution, or is it more of a question of being confident that the staff who would normally engage with that work actually will only cancel those calls which it's appropriate to cancel? And does that in any way capture closures that were made by Garda members assigned to response? I'm not sure if I make that last question clear.
Well, if I might say, there's, as we've said, this is examination really of a process by which we've dealt with these calls. Part of it is the understanding of what our policies and procedures are and how those should be properly applied. So both those who dispatch, but also then those who supervise, both at a local level, but in the control room, all those groups and the members then who attend the scenes all have a responsibility to abide by what our policies and procedures are there, because they're there for a reason, and we've written them in the manner we have because we recognise just the risk that attends to domestic violence, domestic abuse type incidents. So I do think it's appropriate to expect that members, the dispatchers and those who attend will do this properly, and we are entitled to that expectation of them, and that's great. But supervision's even better. So supervision is important in this as well, because that then makes sure that the standard is applied correctly and uniformly and with consistency. So there is a very important element around supervision of this, and that supervision then also applies to the quality of the initial interaction as well. In all its various guises, it's not just in respect of DVSA, but in respect of other incidents as well. So I do think there is a role for supervisors. I think the role they've undertaken at the moment is appropriate, and it looks to be appropriate when I visited the control rooms there. They're doing their job in terms of managing what's coming in and keeping a very tight eye on it. And also then the dispatchers themselves being a little bit more assertive about what's happening out on the ground and the explanations that they're getting back. So all of this is a system, and the additional focus that's been placed on this and on other calls because of the review we've undertaken has had an impact on the behaviours, and I'd hope a lift the quality of service that we're providing, not just in these instances, but in other cases as well.
Thank you, Commissioner. I don't know whether any other member wishes to raise any question. And if not, then can I thank you, Commissioner, and all of your colleagues for the engagement across this afternoon's meetings, and thank my authority colleagues also for their participation today. As I said, this is a topic to which we will be returning because of its significance and substance, and because of the extensive commitment that is being given to the work. And again, as we have done before, once seized, once the significance of it was seized, it is being addressed with diligence. Thank you, everybody. This meeting is now concluded.
Thank you.